بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم وصلى الله على محمد وآله وسلم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وقال تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. My name is David Coolidge, and I will be the khatib here for the next 6 weeks, inshallah. And I live on the other side of Lake Merritt, about 15 minutes away. And earlier this week, I had to pay my Alameda County property taxes. So if any of you guys get an Alameda County property tax bill, they send it to you in the fall, and you can either pay it all at once, or you can pay the first part in the fall and then the second part in the early part of the winter of the next year. So I paid my second installment. Now, one's property taxes are not voluntary. You have to give them. American law, controls our lives, and you will be punished if you don't pay your property taxes. I don't know what the punishment is. I've never tried to test it. But it might be that they just take the money anyways and then charge you a fine, and maybe that there's some jail time, I don't know. But the point is, it's just how it is. But after I paid my property taxes, I did something else. I paid what is called the Shumi land tax. And the Shumi land tax is a voluntary contribution. It's something that a group called the Sogorea Te Land Trust, which is a group based in Alameda County and representing the Ohlone people who are the original inhabitants of this land, that they have encouraged homeowners in the East Bay to give this contribution for the development of and the revitalization of the indigenous communities that were the original inhabitants of this place. So I gave this voluntarily. You go to their website and you explain, what your property is, and then they say this is the recommended contribution. Now, in fact, all it is a contribution to a charitable organization. This masjid is a charitable organization under American law, and being a charitable organization, for example, means that you can give money for the purpose of establishing a masjid or a school, or in this case, this indigenous-led land trust, and you can then deduct that contribution from your yearly taxes to the federal government. It's a whole rule that undergirds the foundation of religious communities in this country. So in fact, it was just that from the eyes of American law. But for the people that have organized this land trust, it's a manifestation of what's often called restorative justice. This idea that there are certain injustices that have happened historically that aren't easy to resolve. They don't get resolved just simply because somebody wins a court case, for example. They take a little bit more because they represent more deep-seated animosities, more deep-seated oppressions, and more deep-seated injustices that people have to face. Now, when we confront this sort of reality, this idea, we are reminded of two attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, two names in particular. Al-Basir, the one who sees everything, and Al-Adl, the one who is perfect justice, the source of all justice. Right, so when we are hoping that Allah will be just with us on Yawm al-Qiyamah, on the Day of Judgment, it's because we know that Allah is just. There is no one who is just like the just. And anyone who is just in this earthly realm is simply manifesting some little bit of that justice that exists in infinity and perfectness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May He be transcended and exalted above whatever we can imagine. For we can't really fully contemplate the essence of Allah. We can't understand Allah in all of Allah's aspects, if you will, Right? We can focus in on certain things. So when we focus in on Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the mercy of Allah, because we are feeling in need and we are feeling under some sort of pressure, and we are calling out for that aspect of Allah to have mercy on us, because we know that Allah has power over us, and mercy is an aspect of treating somebody better than what they expect when you have power over them, right? Justice is treating them with what they expect, right? And what people think is fair. Mercy is to have power, the ability to punish, but then to treat somebody even better than they expect to be treated. So when we're calling out for Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, or Arham Ar-Rahimin, the most merciful of those who show mercy, we're focusing in, we're relating to Allah with that attribute in mind. So in this case, we're thinking about Allah as Al-Basir, the one who has witnessed everything, knows everything, and Al-Adl, the one who is just. Right? Because for example, we all are familiar with the idea of a court case. In a court case, there's not usually just one witness. There are multiple witnesses, because somebody saw this little bit, and somebody saw that little bit, and somebody figured out this little detail. For example, there's a person in Idaho who was accused of 4 murders recently. The court case has begun, and you have to look and see that the police said he did this, and then there was a witness for that, and then there was somebody who said that he said this, and you try to piece it together. And then you come into the courtroom, and then the lawyers have their whole rules that they have to follow in American law. And the point is that no one was the perfect witness of everything that happened. Instead, they're just trying to piece together whatever the most relevant information is in order to arrive at a conclusion. Obviously, Allah doesn't have to do that. Allah is the witness in all moments and in all times, in a way that we can never truly comprehend. The Imam who's been usually giving the khutbahs here, but who hasn't been able to recently, Imam Rashid, his PhD dissertation is about the concept of hayra. And hayra is this idea of being bewildered when you actually get down to thinking about who Allah is. And this is a manifestation of it. Right? We can't fully imagine what it is for a being to be able to witness all things at all times, in all places, and have perfect understanding of them. Right? We are so limited in relationship to that quality. Right? We can know something of knowledge. We can see because Allah is Al-Basir. Right? We can witness because Allah can witness everything. So we have some limited capacity that Allah gives to us so that we can experience something of this existence in this creation. But only Allah is Al-Basir, the all-seeing. So what this reminds us of is that when we look in the Quran is not a text that is focused on historical detail. The Quran wants to get right to the point, and the Quran wants to make a moral point. But there are certain sections of the Quran where you will see that there will be more historical detail than others. So for example, the first juz, the first 30th of the Quran, so the opening section, of Surah Al-Baqarah, you'll find a lot of historical details related to the Bani Israel and to Prophet Musa alayhi salam. And you will see that, if you, for example, there's a book called The Quran and the Bible by Gabriel Said Reynolds. It's published by Yale University Press. He takes a translation of the Quran by Ali Qori Qara'i, and he puts it into conversation with various sources, Bible and otherwise, from the Judeo-Christian tradition. So when it says, for example, in the Quran that Moses struck a rock and these springs of water came out from him, he will put in the commentary, well, that's similar to this part of the Bible, or this part of some text that exists in Hebrew from the early 4th century BC or whatever it is. And so you can see how the Quran is responding to the history of the prophets, Qasasul Anbiya, all those prophets that went before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, such as the Prophet Musa, such as the Prophet Ibrahim, may peace be upon all of them. But then what it does is it, after telling these different stories, of which, for example, the story of the Baqarah, the cow, is one of them. That's why the surah is named Surah Baqarah. It says this verse: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم تلك أمة قد خلت لها ما كسبت ولكم ما كسبتم ولا تسألون عما كانوا يعملون. This is verse 134 of Surah Al-Baqarah. That was a community that had already gone before. For them is what they earned, and for you is what you have earned. And you will not be held accountable for what they have done. So after Allah has told the Prophet Muhammad of all these stories and reminded them, and then the Prophet Muhammad has told his community and his companions about, these are the stories that really matter to Allah, right? We don't have to go and read every single aspect of the Bible. You don't have to be a scholar of the Bible. There's some things that are good, some things are bad. But the basis of it, the story of Musa, the story of Ibrahim, that was true. And now Allah is reminding us of certain aspects of that story. Why? Because there's a purpose, right? And that purpose is that now you are the people who are following prophets. You are the people that have to maintain those prophetic virtues. You are the people that are the challenge of living up to these ideals is now, that burden is on your shoulders, right? So it's not about, you go back and you say, oh, they did it wrong. You should have been Nun. Prophet Joshua shouldn't have done this or shouldn't have done that or something like that. No, the point is that those people had their struggles and they had to implement La ilaha illallah in their lives in the way that Allah wanted them to struggle with their time and their place. And now and then the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to do it in 7th century Arabia because they were the initial people that heard these messages. But now it's 21st century America. What are you going to do? You're not going to be asked necessarily about the details of the past, but you have to learn from the past in terms of coming to terms with what your responsibilities will be. So then we turn to another verse of the Quran that helps us to flesh this out even more, which is Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 135. O you who believe, uphold justice and bear witness to God, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or your close relatives. Whether the person is rich or poor, God can best take care of both. Refrain from following your own desire so that you can act justly. If you distort or neglect justice, God is fully aware of what you do. So all of this reminds us of the centrality of justice in the Islamic worldview, right? That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he came to establish justice. And when we tell the stories of the Prophet Muhammad, we often highlight stories that get that meaning. So for example, I can't speak for other countries, but I've been Muslim for 24 years. How many times I've heard mentioned that the Prophet Muhammad, one of the first things that he did when he was still in Mecca, before he had any sort of political or legal authority over the community, he banned and outlawed the burying of baby girls alive, right? And that makes us proud that he's our prophet, right? Why do we feel proud at that moment? Because we have a feeling of what justice is. We know that that's wrong. We may have not lived in that time, in that place, but we know that that's wrong. And when we see that our prophet was the one who, even when he was weak politically at that moment, under the subjugation of the Quraysh of Mecca, he was to say that you cannot do this. I know that this is part of your culture. I know that this is considered acceptable, but you cannot do this. And we fast forward to 2023 and we see that, for example, in the Republic of India, it is actually illegal to get a sonogram and to reveal the gender of your baby because so many people will abort a girl if that's what they find out it is, right? So it's the same thing, but just a modern method, right? So the struggle that the Prophet was having with Arabian culture in the year 610 or whatever it was when that particular prohibition came down, that is still part of human society, right? And so we understand that even though we're not living in prophetic Mecca or prophetic Medina, we too have this burden of upholding justice as the Quran is reminding ourselves. So when we are centered in this time, in this place, what if we are to tell our stories, what are the stories that matter to us? Yes, of course, we talk about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We talk about the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud. We talk about him, outlawing these things in traditional Arabian custom that were considered wrong and unjust, right? But we also have a sense of who we are right here and right now, right? We are in the city of Oakland. We are in the county of Alameda. We are in the state of California, and we are in the United States of America. And each one of these things has a history, just as Mecca had a history. When the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was confronting those injustices, he deeply understood his society. He absolutely understood it inside and out just as much as any traditional Arabian man would have done, right? And so too, when we are called to think about how Islam relates to here and now, we become experts in American history, to make a larger point. And what we often forget is that American history is built on the backs of those who were here before us, right? My ancestors came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, almost 400 years ago, from England, right? And then they stayed in Massachusetts, and then when my great-great-grandfather, James Henry Coolidge, he ended up going out to Illinois and starting a farm in Galesburg, Illinois, and that's where my great-grandfather was born, and then he migrated to Chicago, and then my grandfather and my father and myself were all born in Chicago, and now I'm here in Oakland, California. My own silsila, my own shajara, my own lineage goes back from West Coast to East Coast and is part of the story of America, right? But so, there's too much to tell about the entire story of America. We will revisit this concept in later khutbahs, inshallah ta'ala. But right now I want to speak a little bit about the history of this place that I think is important for us to remember. Again, you can always emphasize different things. So you can criticize me for choosing any of the topics I will bring up, but the point is that we are reflecting upon how we got here right now to understand what our moral and ethical responsibilities under the gaze of Al-Basir, the all-seeing, and Al-Adl, the perfectly just, will be for us in this day, in this place. So we recognize that before there was any Europeans in this place, for perhaps 15,000 years. No one knows for sure. This is a debated thing historically, but at least 10,000 years, perhaps 15,000 years, perhaps more, people had come down the west coast of the Americas and settled in all sorts of different places, all the way, north to where Alaska is, all the way down to South America. And so for thousands of years, there were people living in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when we talk about them, we usually refer to them as the Ohlone people, O-H-L-O-N-E. A previous generation called them Costanoans, but generally the term now is used as Ohlone people. I said on the other side of Lake Merritt. There's a street over there called Trestle Glen. It's a very popular place for people to celebrate Halloween, for example. Trestle Glen, in the earliest accounts from Europeans, it's acknowledged that Trestle Glen was in site of a Native American encampment. Right? There were different tribes and different groups of people in different places. But the point is that they were scattered all throughout this area. And then the Spanish came, part of the Spanish Empire. Right? And many of us know, for example, in Muslim history, that 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but we also know 1492 was when Granada fell. Right? So the relationship between the Catholic Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula and the expulsion of Muslims from what we now call Spain is tied in also with the Spanish exploration and conquest of the New Worlds. They're two sides of the same coin. So the Spanish Empire came up the California coast, and in 1797, just to give you a specific date, 1797, the San Jose Mission was established. Now, the various Catholic orders that ran these missions alongside the soldiers from the Spanish Empire, would gather the Native Americans as much as they could onto these basically large farms. Many of them got sick. So a lot of the damage in terms of the population was done at that point. There was an attempt to convert them to Roman Catholic Christianity, an attempt to keep them from being hunter-gatherers, and instead become people of agriculture. And so this was the precursor to the American experience. This was the Spanish Empire at this time. And then one of the soldiers named Don Luis Maria Peralta in 1820, in exchange for his service, his lifelong service to the Spanish colonial army, was given a land grant. It's called the Peralta Land Grant. So everything in Oakland and Berkeley and in a couple other areas like Alameda and little parts of Albany, perhaps, those were all part of his holdings. So at that point, it was essentially one man's land. And at this point, there were less, direct Native American settlements upon that land. I don't know all the details. Perhaps if there was any left, perhaps he, kicked them out. Maybe he used them for, labor. Maybe he had them enslaved. I don't know all the history. but I'm just giving you these dates. So by 1820, so about 200 years ago, this became, all part of his property. In 1848, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was signed between Mexico and America after the Mexican-American War, California became part of the United States of America. It didn't become a state overnight, but it became part of the holdings of the United States of America. And what ended up happening is in 1849, as many of you may know, happened the gold rush. Gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevadas, and everything changed overnight. And I was reading that, the year 1848, I think it said something like, 15 to 20 ships were said to have landed in San Francisco Harbor. In 1849, almost 800 landed in San Francisco Harbor. And these are people coming from all over looking to get rich and buying up supplies and just going off into the wilderness to try to make their claim, right? Make their wealth, make their name in history. But what ends up happening, and this is not controversial, this is well documented, is that they committed a genocide. This book is called Murder State, California's Native American Genocide, 1846 to 1873. There's another book called An American Genocide, and these are both written by professional historians who teach in the university system in California. It's well documented that this is by a textbook example of genocide. That all these, usually men, went out and they just slaughtered, people en masse, raped people en masse, and decimated the Native American tribes of Northern California. And this is happening at the beginning of Californian statehood. Governor Gavin Newsom, our current governor, is the first governor, as far as I know, who has actually uttered the word genocide. In a sort of reconciliation meeting with various Native American tribes, he used the word genocide to describe what happened to the original inhabitants of this land. So when the Sogoreate Land Trust, for those of you who weren't here, who is a group of Native Americans in the East Bay, are asking people to voluntarily contribute, those who own property on this land, they're looking for that restorative justice. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about genocide, complete decimation of ways of life, whole peoples gone forever, right? But then there's still people that remain, right? The history of Native Americans in this country is not of complete being wiped out, but is also of people remaining and still struggling to this day to fight that we remember these stories, right? Just as we remember the Prophet Muhammad and the struggles that he went through. They want every American to know these stories and to remember these stories. And it's very important for us to remember that genocide is different than winning a battle or winning a long-term struggle for conquest, right? You can conquer another people and not commit genocide. For example, the early Muslims conquered Egypt, the Nile River Valley, which had been a center of civilization for 1,000 years prior to Muslims, right? And according to the historian Ira Lapidus, in one article, he said that it took at least 300 years for you even to become majority Muslim, right? And then to this day, the Coptic Christian community in Egypt is 10 to 15% of the population, right? So Muslims conquered Egypt, but they did not commit a genocide against the majority Christian population that had been living there. I mean, Egypt had been for hundreds of years a center of Christian intellectual ferment. Origin of Alexandria, St. Anthony of the Desert, all these famous Christian figures were prior to the arrival of Muslims, right? But the Muslims didn't wipe them out, right? So 300 years after the Muslims conquered the Nile River Valley, still perhaps a majority Christian, God knows best, maybe there's more research on that been done recently, but it's been 200 years since this land sort of became under sort of the formal jurisdiction of a European, power, originally the Spanish, and then now the United States of America. And how many of you knew this history? How many people in the Bay Area know this history? I mean, alhamdulillah, the East Bay is a place where there's, I think, a little bit more awareness of these things than many other parts of the country. But the point is, in 200 years, the memory of people has been erased. And so we're here to remember that. And what is one of the lessons that we learn from this? I mean, there's many, many lessons, so we could perhaps reflect on this in different ways. But I think one of the most obvious lessons that we learn is stated by Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam in one hadith, رَأْسُ كُلِّ خَطِيئَةٍ حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا. The foundation of every vice is the love of this world. When all those people came streaming in by the thousands into California after 1849, looking for a little piece of the dunya, literally a little piece of golden rock, and they were willing to rape and slaughter and decimate to get it. I mean, where is the main problem? Yes, it's racism. Yes, it's capitalism. But going more deeply into the human psyche, it's hubbud dunya. It's love for this dunya. I'm willing to trample upon other people's rights. I'm willing to decimate other people so I can get what I want from the dunya. Right? And it may be an extreme example. I'm not saying that we're like that, alhamdulillah. Right? But the fact that that was just 200, that was less than 200 years ago in this very place. And in, if you go up to Sacramento and you go into the Sierras, you go to Tahoe, whatever, I mean, all this land is riddled with blood and bones from this story, right? And why? Hubbud dunya, love for this dunya. Right? It was not about, there was no sort of like, if you read this book, there was no sort of like, we're going to even civilize them. It wasn't even like a racist civilizing mission. It was like, no, we're just going to literally wipe them all out so we can have what we want. And so that's a reminder to all of us about the darkness that can sometimes dwell in the human heart. And when we remember these stories, and when we allow ourselves to feel that pain, when we allow ourselves to grieve, and we allow that pain and that grief that we feel, that empathy that we feel for people that we'll never see in this world, right? But we know that they were here, that actually can inspire us to greater levels of sacrifice for the sake of justice, and for the sake of love for other human beings, and for the sake of wanting a better world for everybody who's here now, right? Because there's nothing we can do to change the past. And when we're remembering the past, it's not just to feel bad about it. What happened, happened. But it can inspire us, and it can center us, and it can lead us to greater awareness of how we can be agents of change in this moment, in this time, in this place, if we have the himmah, if we have the sort of desire to do that ourselves as best as we can. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi alladhi allama bil qalam. علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم وصلى الله على محمد وآله وسلم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. قل هو الله أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد. الله الصمد. لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. وقال تعالى: يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So that is the history of this place, right? But it's part of a larger history. And what scholars, historians call that history is what we call settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is when your main goal in colonizing a people is to take their land. And that's different from, for example, extractive colonialism, which would be a description of how the British colonized India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. When the British, there are not that many British people in the world. They didn't want to take all the land of India. Like, there's plenty of room in the UK for British people to live, more or less. They wanted the resources. That was what they wanted most of all, right? They wanted the jewels, they wanted the foodstuffs, they wanted the spices. We have to remember spice was actually like a huge commodity in the past. And so on and so forth. That they wanted to extract wealth from South Asia, right? But when Europeans came to North America, the thing that they wanted more than anything else was the land, right? And we see that is the same reality today in Palestine, right? The struggle that the Palestinian people have been going up through since 1949, and even going back before the creation of the State of Israel, is also a struggle against settler colonialism, right? Because there's only so much land to go around. And so, if you have looked at a map of the West Bank before, you can see how it's literally being carved out piece by piece by piece. It's a sort of highly technical, highly, overly surveillance, sort of focused approach to sort of parceling up the land as much as you can so that the settlers in the West Bank can have as much as they can have, and they have their own highways and all sorts of things. And so, settler colonialism is something that happens in different times and places. In the case of the United States of America, it happened over the course of hundreds of years. And, there were different sort of moments when the native peoples resisted. In 1675, 1676, in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, there was something called King Philip's War. King Philip was the name given to one of the Native American leaders who decided that he'd had enough of the encroachment upon native lands, and he launched a war against the colonists. Eventually he lost, and if I remember correctly when I was reading about it, he ended up being sold into slavery in the Caribbean, as well as his wife and children. That was part of his punishment. Then in 1813 there was Tecumseh, who at this point, after the American Revolution had happened, and the sort of settlers were streaming over the Appalachian Mountains, coming over what's called the Ohio River Valley, the Native American tribes were sort of strong on the north side of the Ohio River. So it was now Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And so in Indiana, Tecumseh gathered together a coalition, a tribal coalition, very similar to how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gathered a tribal coalition to create his army after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. That Tecumseh tried to gather all these different tribes together to sort of once and for all keep the white people on the south side of the Ohio River. Unfortunately, he was defeated, and the sort of tidal wave continued to the Mississippi River. So when I told the story of my own family and my great-great-grandfather, James Henry Coolidge, being the first of my lineage to leave Massachusetts and come to Illinois to create a farm in Galesburg, Illinois, that was because Tecumseh lost, right? It was because Tecumseh lost that then white Europeans could imagine settling places like rural Illinois and creating farms. And so once that resistance had been shattered, then my grandfather could be part of that continued migration westward. So this is what I'm partially giving this to sort of exemplify this verse of Quran that I mentioned in the first khutbah. O you who believe, uphold justice and bear witness to God, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or your close relatives, right? My own family is part of this history. So then you have, another famous figure, Geronimo, which was in New Mexico, Arizona area in 1886, who held out against the U.S. Frontier Army for quite a long time, but it was eventually defeated, and his people were sort of all rounded up. And this is how we have Native American reservations to this day, right? If you travel, especially throughout like the center of this country, because the greatest wars were called the Plains Indian Wars, which happened, predominantly in the 19th century, the 1800s. There's a whole history to it, but if there's very large reservations. Some of you may have been aware of the whole thing that happened at Standing Rock. That was, I don't know, about 5-6 years ago, I can't remember at this point. But Standing Rock is one of those large reservations in the Midwest. There's Pine Ridge and so many other places. But these were the places that were, not prime agricultural lands, not prime hunting lands that were given to, those who had been defeated. So as I mentioned before, the point of this is not, to sort of tell a story about, just one side was all good and one side was all bad, but to remember this history and to let that remembrance infuse the present, right? Because for better or for worse, we are the heirs. Whether we were born in this country or whether we came from another country, if we're living here now, we are heirs to this story. We are part of this story. Just as if, for example, flash forward 200 years from now, let's say Israel has completely wiped out the Palestinians and it's just Israel and just how they want it. And then we all move, some of our descendants move to Israel to have a good job or whatever, political freedom or whatever it is that they want there. And they have no idea of the history of the Palestinian resistance for so many decades, going back, for example, in our case, from 1949 all the way until 2023. right? We would instinctually be like, that would be such a tragedy. We've lived our whole lives and watched the Palestinians resist the continuous encroachment upon their lands. And then flash forward 200 years, it's as if it never happened, right? It's just the winners are there and the winners write history. So we don't want to be like that. We want to be people who have a more subtle moral and ethical approach that we can, most of the world doesn't care about the history of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We are the people that make that history and tell that history all the time. Battle of Badr, tell the history of the boycott of the Banu Hashim when for 3 years they were eating leaves because they were being persecuted by the Quraysh. And we tell those stories to our children, and then our children tell those stories to their children so that that story doesn't die in human history, because we believe that Prophet Muhammad, his fight was for a purpose and for a good cause. And we can connect that feeling, that feeling of wanting to remember and wanting to be on the right side of history to the stories of the United States of America, and that's what I'm trying to do. If we were living in a different place, perhaps we would tell a different story. If we were living in Indiana, perhaps the story would focus upon Tecumseh and what he had to do in his particular time and place. But we're here in California, and so that's why I focus on the history of California specifically, because we also have to remember, that peoples are diverse, right? There may be large things that draw people together, but people are diverse, right? There is a reality to recognizing all the distinctions of other people that we previously didn't know. So that we know that the Ohlone people are very different from the Northern Cheyenne. And we know that the Northern Cheyenne are very different from the Arapaho and other Native American communities. I'm a white person who was married into a South Asian family. Like, I think when I married into a South Asian family, I just thought there's like Indians and there's Pakistanis and there's Bangladeshis. But then I actually got to know people, and I was in a family that was unlike my own. I know, oh no, there's like Biharis, and there's Konkanis, and there's Punjabis, and there's Tamils, and all these different versions of Indians, for example. I just didn't know that before, right? As a white person growing up, it was like there's Polish and there's Lithuanian and there's Italian and there's German. Even when I grew up, like Germans were a little bit different. Like they were different, Catholic, and they liked to drink lots of beer and all these stereotypes that I grew up with, right? So that's like a white person living in a white world. You notice all the differences amongst white people, and then everybody else is like they're just the Native Americans. They're all one thing, or they're just Indians. But when you get to know people and you actually care about their stories, right, and you care about their histories and you care about their families and you care about their culture, all of a sudden you start to see things that you never thought before, and you realize how ignorant you were in the past, right? So part of it is to also recognize that yes, there's this large story, and there may be places where there wasn't technically like a genocide. Maybe there was just a battle, and then a treaty was signed, and this was the outcome of that battle and that treaty for that particular group of people. But when we're talking about Northern California, where we live, it is absolutely documented, for those of you who weren't here, that a genocide took place here less than 200 years ago. And even the governor of California has called it a genocide. So we should be people that keep the story of that going and recognize that has yet to really be grappled with by California as a state. That at its founding, there was a genocide here. So if we, inshallah, will be people that can bring some modicum of justice into the world through our lives, but also recognizing that ultimately all earthly justice is in the hands of Imam Mahdi, and all of eternal justice is on Yawm al-Qiyamah, right? That all the people that died in the past, there's nothing we can actually do necessarily to like right that wrong in any sort of way that means something to them. Their day will be on Yawm al-Qiyamah, when Allah al-Basir al-Adl, the all-seeing and the perfectly just, will be able to set everything right. Right? But then we also look forward to an earthly resolution. We have to be people that strive for justice as best as we can. What little power, little wealth we have in Oakland, California in 2023, the best we can do, and then leave the rest up to Allah and the tawfiq that He will give to Imam Mahdi, as affirmed by both Sunni and Shi'i theology. So with that, I conclude. I would like to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless the soul of Miss Roxana Safai, who was a member of this community who passed away recently, and for Allah to bless all of your marhameen, all the people in your families and in your lives that you were thinking of in this moment that have passed away before us. That Allah bless them all in the barzakh and give them all a beautiful time in the barzakh, and may we all be reunited with our loved ones on the last day. We'll recite Fatiha for them. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين Ya Arhamar Rahimin, O most merciful of those who show mercy, Ya Basir, Ya Adil, the all-seeing one and the perfectly just. Ya Allah, we ask you to help us to be reflections of your justice in this time, in this place. We are fallible. We have so many things that we don't know. And sometimes, even when we know the right thing, we sometimes give in to our own inclinations and we care too much about hubbud dunya. We love this world and we want things from it and we're willing to trample on other people to get it. But Ya Allah, we ask you for your forgiveness in this moment and for your tawfiq, for your success, that we may be individually and collectively with ourselves and our communities and our families and as members of this larger state of California, that we may be people that push the needle towards justice, Ya Allah, in our own lives, and that you may give us the insight to see how to do that. Ya Arhamar Rahimin, La ilaha illa ant, subhanak inni kuntu min adh-dhalimin, subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk, wa aqimus salat.